and seriously injured rugby players who were living with spinal cord injury. So when the panel first met in 2019, they took a look at existing clinical PPI approaches and examined their suitability for a preclinical research project. And in examining that, they identified a gap in the research for an innovative preclinical PPI approach to suit the needs of the project. So the panel there that's us in the middle. We've moved online since the COVID-19 pandemic, and the panel meets regularly to discuss the work of the project. But from this gap identified, that's where my PhD comes in on the bottom left. So my PhD project aims to develop an evidence-informed guidelines for preclinical PPI, and that consists of two strands. On one side, it's researching PPI using methods which should be very familiar to those of you doing health services research. So that'll be interview studies, a scoping review, Delphi study, and a process evaluation. And we're also doing PPI, and that's the work of the panel. And then the findings from the research inform the panel. But the focus of the talk today will be on the panel itself, because I think that's most interesting or novel for this talk. So if you just press next, I think there's one more piece on the bottom. So some of the ways that we work together, we collaborate on reviewing ethics applications and survey instruments for interview study. We collaborate together on research posters. We write and prepare research publications together, and we collaborate to disseminate our work through the Spinal Research Institute of Melbourne. So next slide, please. So how do we adapt PPI for a preclinical research project? Well, the panel meets formally twice a year, but also regularly collaborates throughout the year. The PPI contributors on the panel are in regular contact with Dr. Adrian Dervin, who's the lead researcher of the Spinal Cord repair project. And I think that really demonstrates the value of the process, that sometimes you just can't wait 6 months to share some news or discuss some research. So the regular collaboration goes on. When the panel first was formed, the initial meetings worked on building relationships. And I think that's something Jennifer alluded to earlier, that you take the time to build these relationships, and everyone gets to know each other, develop a shared understanding, and become comfortable and learn to trust each other before getting into the real work. Then the later meeting agendas are increasingly based upon the requests and needs of panel members, which is fantastic, because panel members can submit particular areas of interest that they'd like to see covered in meetings. Now, the activities covered in these meetings vary greatly from session to session, but they generally cover research updates from the research team about the research project, presentations on areas of interest for panel members, which, for example, could be on stem cells or on scar tissue. We discuss our project dissemination, how we share our approach, and we do Q&A sessions between panel members. So panel members can submit questions of one another based on their areas of expertise to ask questions and generate and facilitate discussion. We moved to Zoom at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's pictures from our latest Zoom meeting in January. And one of the ways we can capture input and data from these meetings is through online collaboration software such as Miro. So the bottom image then is just some of the feedback we captured in relation to discussing something in spinal cord injury. Next slide, please. So what are some of the challenges for PPI in preclinical research? Well, firstly, it's not an obvious place for PPI to take place. This may be due to the apparent distance between lab-based research and the day-to-day experiences of people's lives who live with particular conditions such as spinal cord injury. But why is it important to conduct PPI in this context? Well, it's important because preclinical research may form the foundation of later clinical work. And it's also very important from these early stages to have involvement and to ensure that people are involved from the earliest stages of the research cycle. And then what are some of the challenges? Well, one of the big challenges with preclinical PPI is value added and perceptions of value added. You know, as many researchers will say, time doing PPI is time away from the lab. So trying to develop guidelines and standardize the approach and show the value of PPI in a project like this is really important in overcoming these challenges. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give a small example of one of the ways we've collaborated together as part of the panel. Next slide, please. So this is an example of some of the collaboration that we've done as part of the PPI advisory panel. We developed a spinal cord injury research infographic. and just to explain the nature of the research. So that actually arose from some of the research conducted into PPI, where we found that there was a real desire for more resources and more information about the spinal cord repair project. So Dr. Adrian Durbin started to develop one, and the first draft is there on the left. So we were able to present that at one of the PPI advisory panel meetings and gather feedback on what people thought about it. And that feedback, then some of the points are there in the middle. And generally the feedback was to contextualize it around images and CT scans rather than use diagrams, and to try and use more everyday words that emphasize function, such as restoring connection, rather than focusing terminology. So then we ended up with the one on the right, which is all feedback integrated into it. And again, it's fantastic. This just emerged as part of the PPI process, and we were able to do that in collaboration with the panel. So next slide, please. So finally, what are some of the lessons that we've learned throughout our process? Well, firstly, relationship building takes time. As alluded to earlier, it takes a while to become comfortable with each other and trust each other, and generate that shared understanding. And we found that our dynamics changed considerably over time as panel members became more comfortable and more used to working with one another. We also find it's very important to start by focusing on what panel members want to know. So identifying a common ground between researchers and PPI contributors forms a strong foundation for involvement. So that, for example, would be like our Q&A sessions, where panel members can submit questions to one another just based on their background in the area of expertise. And that's a really good basis to facilitate discussion. Finally, we found the COVID-19 pandemic held some unexpected benefits for advisory panel process. The online meeting format proved really flexible, in terms of moving the meeting if necessary, or arranging just people to be able, making sure people could actually go to the meeting. And there was also an interesting impact on power dynamics, which are often so entrenched in research. After the initial online meeting, some of the researchers noted that it was much easier to have a discussion online using these online platforms, because the quote I have was, no matter what your background is, everyone's square on Zoom is the same size. Everyone is, able to have the same amount of presence in the conversation. And we really found that interesting as an unexpected benefit of the COVID-19 pandemic and moving to the platform. And next slide, please. That's it from me anyway. So thank you very much. And I'll be happy to take any questions.
Brilliant, Pádraig. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. And I love that comment about the power dynamics and kind of I suppose the benefits of COVID and moving to online. What we might do is maybe hold all our questions till the end and get a nice Q&A, kind of a discussion going after everyone has spoken. And I'd encourage everyone here to just pop your questions into the chat and we can have a nice discussion on that as we go. So next up, I'd like to introduce James Larkin and Tony Hickey, and of course Joe, who is with us as well. So James is a PhD candidate in the Department of General Practice in the RCSI, and like I mentioned, he's being joined by PPI contributor Tony Hickey, and they're going to present on the burden of financial costs for people with multimorbidity. So take it away.
Super, thanks a million, Nikki. So yeah, myself and Tony are going to give you a quick overview of what we and other PhD students and panel members have been working on for the last 3 years. So firstly, to give you a brief background, so we're a group of 4 PhD students. So Professor Susan Smith got funding from the Health Research Board in 2018 for a collaborative doctoral award in multimorbidity. And so we have myself, Louise Foley, a health psychologist, Dr. Bridget Kiley, a GP, and Aisling Croke, a pharmacist. And we all work in different areas of multimorbidity. Myself, I work in the area of financial burden and multimorbidity, and that whole area actually arose from my supervisor, Professor Susan Smith, going to a PPI group in NUIG with Adele Murphy and getting feedback about this area. So as part of the PhDs, there was funding from the HRB to set up a PPI panel. So the four of us in 2018, 2019 auspiciously went out and tried to do that. And we had great help from Adele Murphy in NUIG, and we've also had great help from Maria Pierce, who's been doing an evaluation on it. And I'm going to hand over to Tony now to give you a brief overview of what the panel looks like.
Hello, everybody. The panel, our PPI group has about 7 active patient members, and we've been meeting with the PhD students on a roughly 2 monthly basis for more than 3 years now. Our early meetings were face-to-face, but together with the rest of the world, we went online from March 2020. The PPI group is an eclectic group. The PPI patient group is an eclectic group of men and women of all ages and from all parts of the country, and all with different backgrounds. The common denominator is that we each live our lives with more than one chronic health condition for which we are receiving ongoing treatment from the Irish health system with varying degrees of success. We bring to the group our own individual perspectives and life experiences. We conduct our meetings in a respectful but light-hearted way. A strong bond of friendship and support has developed between members over the last 3 years.
Great, cheers, Tony. So myself and Tony are going to bring you through a kind of an infographic that the 11 of us kind of developed, essentially giving advice on public and patient involvement based on all of our experiences over the last 3 years. So could you give me the next slide, please? So first, it kind of goes in sequential order. So first off, in terms of recruitment, I suppose we tried to focus on including diverse perspectives. We recruited from NGOs, through healthcare physicians, through personal contacts. We reached out often via a trusted person, and we made sure to try to offer necessary support for participation. One of the big ones was having funding to provide reimbursement. And one thing that I found kind of difficult, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it, Tony, was kind of explaining things at the start. You know, it took me a year or two to get my head around what PPI was, and I don't know if we explained it very well to you, Tony, when we were first recruiting things. I don't know what you remember about that.
Yeah, I remember when you approached me, James, and recruited me to the group, and really I hadn't a clue what I was letting myself in for. No idea at all, but sounded interesting, and it sounded, you know, an enjoyable experience. So I guess I trusted you at that particular moment.
Thanks for placing your trust in me, Tony. Hope you don't regret it now. You might take the next slide, Tony, if that suits.
Yeah, so our first meeting was held in a city centre hotel in 2019. I remember feeling a little anxious and nervous going into the meeting. You know, what will it be like? Who are these people in the group? So all of those questions were very much to the forefront of my mind going into that meeting.
Yeah, and I suppose from our perspective, our big focus was to try to create some sort of build relationships between ourselves and yourselves, and also between, you know, the members, and between between each other, and also do more work on explaining what our plans were, as well as, I suppose, providing information about research at kind of a introductory level in order to build a foundation for the rest of it. Now, one piece of constructive feedback that we got was that maybe we were, and I know I don't think you felt like this, Tony, but that maybe we were a bit condescending, and I think it maybe spoke to our lack of experience doing this kind of thing and working with patients. I don't know if you've perspective on that, Tony.
No, I never felt that about the group. I mean, certainly the first meeting, you know, the picture started to become a little clearer, and the fog started to break up a little bit. And, you know, I'd say over those first few months, we came to understand what it was all about. But no, I mean, I got a sense from the beginning that you guys were doing your best to communicate and explain to us what this thing was all about, which of course was new to us and to yourselves at that time.
Yeah, and I suppose what became clear is the amount of time we needed to give those explanations in order before we could even get into the meatier bits of influencing our projects. Next slide, please. So then in terms of the practicalities, as Tony was saying, we moved to online, and now we're in a new world where, there's questions about whether things will be online, as default, or in person, or hybrid. And I suppose, our advice would be, have dynamic conversations on that, asking people about their preferences. A good example we give is, and maybe it speaks to, about maybe us being maybe not considering things at the start, was we kind of assumed, about having shorter meetings maybe would suit people better, and then we were trying to cram loads of things in, and then we'd actually ask people, oh, could we actually do this a bit longer? And everyone was like, oh, yeah, of course, no problem. So just kind of keeping those lines of communication open around practicalities is very valuable. I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that, Tony?
Yeah, I mean, just on practicalities, our first few meetings were face to face, and one of the nice aspects about that was there was always nice tea and coffee and cakes served. Then, of course, when we went to the bleak months and years of online, we had to retain the memory of that coffee and tea and cakes in our minds to carry us through that long winter. But I think it all worked out fine, really.
I think so too, but I think at the start actually what comes to mind is that the kind of conversations around the meeting were quite valuable in terms of building relationships, having small chats before and after the meeting or during breaks that I find are much harder online.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. There would be always, after the formal meeting ended, there'd be an opportunity to just, have informal chats with people, and I suppose get to know them a bit more in depth as a human being, So so in a sense, it's kind of fortunate that we weren't online from the beginning, because we had that first year of meetings, which gave us that opportunity, and I think that has stood to us then over the duration of the period.
Big time. Perfect. Next slide, please.
So like from the outset, communication between group members, it's been respectful and characterized by good listening. Every effort is made to ensure that all members have an opportunity to express themselves, and medical jargon is kept to a minimum.
Yeah, and it's certainly feedback that came back from you guys sometimes, that we'd give you guys a document, say an ethics application or even a piece, and it just the jargon or the length of it would be just from your perspective, way too much. So it's something we've learned more, and even the term multimorbidity, it's been a learning process that, that's been a term that was developed by academics and has patients have very little ownership over. So we've used people with several ongoing conditions, and trying to, keep that in our vernacular is we found important. Also in terms of listening, I found the challenges I faced has been kind of being clear about what we can and can't do. We were giving funding for very specific projects, and sometimes yourself, Tony, or other panel members would have excellent ideas of ways we could really change things, but I suppose we either don't have the courage or just can't do those things sometimes, and it's about being honest and giving feedback about that at the time. Next slide, please. So then between meetings, so the whole building relationship thing, it's providing contact details and keeping those lines of communication open between meetings, following up afterwards to ask about whether there was anything about the meeting that was okay. Some people have varying levels of engagement, and it's about maybe giving them more before the meetings or after the meetings. So one idea we've had is maybe establish a system of sharing ideas. Now we don't have between meetings. Now we don't have that now, but the informal lines of communication are there. So I think I don't. So for example, one of the members, Declan, just posted me a questionnaire that he was sent, and he was like, "Oh, I think this would really be relevant to one of your projects." I don't know what your perspectives are, support between meetings, and how that's gone, Tony.
Well, certainly in terms of supplying, agendas and relevant documentation in advance of the meeting, that's always something that you guys are very much on top of, and it's very much appreciated. However, like that idea of having some kind of a platform which we could use between meetings, either to reflect on the previous meeting, because sometimes things occur to me after a meeting that, if there was a platform there, I would use it. So it might might help to kind of bond and gel the group a bit more. So yeah.
Yeah, especially in the online context with last year's, it's maybe something we could have done a bit better. Next slide, please.
So so speaking personally, like I owe a huge debt of gratitude to the medical profession. It's no exaggeration to say that I wouldn't be here today were it not for the help and support of my psychiatrist over many years. There's only so many bunches of flowers and boxes of chocolates you can give to someone like that. So when James presented me with another means of expressing my gratitude to the medical profession, I jumped at it. I'd have to say it's been a pleasure being a member of this group for the last 3 years. The PhD students and the patients are lovely to work with, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the whole experience.
Yeah, and it's been extremely valuable for us. Like I was saying earlier, like even the most basic things you start to question, like constant use of the term multimorbidity. And every time I read a paper now, I see people write like things like multimorbid patients, and I just recoil and or write things like PPI was not necessary for this project. And by engaging with people more and understanding their perspectives on some of the most basic aspects of our assumptions, it's kind of reframe that, as well as having very practical implications for lots of our projects, and also building relationships and learning learning from each other. So thanks everyone for listening. Myself and Tony will be around at the end to answer any questions, and Joe as well, I hope.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Tony and James, and of course Joe. Lots of really nice reflections there around the kind of practicalities around communication and the honesty, and I'm sure we can circle back to that at the end. But I would like to now introduce Nerli Catha, who is a Sphere Scholar at the School of Public Health, Physiotherapy, Sports and Science in UCD. And Nerli will be presenting with Ayrton Kelly, Jason Pope, and Eve Scully, and they're going to present on a mixed methods exploration of protective factors that promote LGBTI plus youth well-being.
Hello everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present. Could you maybe go back to the first slide? Thank you very much. Okay, so we're talking about learning with LGBTI plus youth, and the reason that we've chosen to use this image of the jigsaw is really with the idea that we're all part of the jigsaw and we all bring something and have expertise by experience around something. So it's about bringing my expertise by experience as a researcher, as a social worker, as somebody who's worked in policy, and bringing that to the experience that the young people bring as young people who have grown up in Ireland, who are LGBTI or allies, and who want to be involved in research, but also who have a rich experience in policy making in their own right. So next slide, please. So this is the four of us who are presenting today. And the way that we're going to do this, I'm going to present a little bit about my PhD, and really with the question in mind, why PPI for researchers and is it worth it? And then the second half of our presentation is going to be turning it over to the young people and asking them, is it worth it from their perspective? So as you can see, I'm doing my PhD and I have a project called YUP, which is Young People's Panels for Youth Perspectives and Priorities. And Erton, Kelly, Jason Pope and Neve Scully are presenting with me today as YUP members, but also come from a rich background of being involved in the LGBTI National Youth Strategy, and we're involved in the Youth Advisory Group for that strategy. Next slide, please. So the National Youth Strategy had 3 overarching goals. The first about having safe, inclusive environments. The second about focusing on health and all aspects of health. And the third about developing the research and data environment, and really about enhancing the quality of that research. So we have a lot of research that is directed around risks and much less research focused around things that are protective and things that promote well-being. And my research is very much aligned to this idea of research into mental health. And I would put that the idea of positive mental health into a much broader conceptualization of well-being, which includes times of where we might have compromised mental health and we might have mental illness, but that can sit along times of wellness. And the other part of that is looking at growing up in Ireland data. So growing up in Ireland for the first time included questions on sexual orientation and gender identity in 2016 with young people from that study at the age of 17 and 18. So next slide, please. So when we use the LGBTI+ acronym, it's used in the Irish policy context, and it's really broadening this idea around sexual orientation, gender and identity, and sex development being beyond a binary. So we're not talking about gay and straight when we're talking about sexual orientation. It's much broader and it's much more fluid than that. My generation might be struggling to understand this, but young people absolutely get this. It's worth us learning with them because they are a lot ahead of us on this, and they give me a lot of hope because they see these things beyond a binary. And also I have to say they see mental health beyond a binary of mentally ill or mentally well as well. And just a little bit of a preview from growing up in Ireland, we know that 1 in 10 young people in Ireland identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, asexual, or describe their gender as other. And we are expecting that 1 in 10 number to go up based on this matching very much trends that we see overseas. So it is very much a watch this space, and that's about young people recognizing that this is much broader and more fluid than my generation would ever have thought. Next slide, please. So my PhD is a mixed methods PhD aligned to the strategy, and it had a policy component, scoping review, and growing up in Ireland analysis, and all of that was embedded within a PPI framework. And as I was saying, the YUP project was very central to this, and that was about convening young people's panels with youth perspectives and priorities. So I got ethical approval from UCD, from the Humanities Research Ethics Committee, to conduct workshops with young people who were aged 16 to 24. Now, nobody could believe that I got ethical approval for this, because usually to work with young people under 16, and especially young people who are considered to be seldom heard, and then especially if they're considered more vulnerable, and then especially if you're talking about a sensitive topic. But I got the ethical approval and everything was going well, and we had everything in place around doing all of this, and I was about to go off trotting around the country, convening all my workshops and all that kind of thing, and looking at a kind of a collaborative approach to policy analysis around identifying the variables from growing up in Ireland and which numbers to crunch, and doing an analysis of the scoping review and growing up in Ireland findings. But next slide. As we know, the PhD is a bit like real life. So I'd say when COVID hit, I might have been either on the ladder between the two flags, or maybe somewhere in the kind of the boat, desperately bailing out the water, because everything came to a big halt. So next slide, it should come up. Yeah, so COVID kind of put a stop to everything, and it wasn't going to be possible for me to do the workshops in person. And COVID, I suppose, as others have mentioned, there is kind of a blessing with it as well. So next slide. I spent a lot of time thinking about what it was about how I wanted to work with the young people and how I wanted to embed PPI, and developed this kind of idea of a cycle, I suppose, which looks very linear and is much more messy than that. But this really kind of informed the way that I was approaching this and what I wanted to do. And at the same time, I was working with two of the young people from the youth advisory group with the strategy, and we were writing a book chapter. And really the involvement of the young people right back to the consulting stage and designing the project helped me realign the whole project. So next slide. So when we're looking at embedding this expertise by experience, next. So that is the paper from, so the paper on the top right-hand corner is the paper which outlines that kind of model of practice and that kind of thing. Then the policy component, the visible, valued and included on the top left-hand side, is the book chapter co-authored with Erton, who's on this presentation today, and with Tara Colleen. And that book chapter, we have just got funding. So I got Tussler Seed Initiative funding for participation funding. I said that all wrong, for making the book chapter open access. So that will be available, which for me is really important because it's about amplifying young voices. Then in terms of the scoping review, so next, and then the next one. So we published a protocol, and in our protocol, which is a bit like a roadmap for what we intended to do, I had very clearly said that what I wanted to do was to include PPI, because young people's perspectives are very rich, and the collaboration with the young people on that. So we had 7 people on the study team, and 5 of those people were from LGBTI communities, and 2 of them were youth who are researchers in their own rights. And we also then had the PPI young people who contributed their thoughts when we kind of like had things coming up from the findings. And then the final image. So I was invited to submit an article to youth, and I've gone back to the group, to our YUP group, and I've asked them, are they interested in us taking the work that we have been doing about looking at the Growing Up in Ireland question, placement and phrasing, and taking all of that qualitative work that we've done about how you ask questions and what is good phrasing of these kinds of questions, because we want our communities to count in policy. And so we're going to co-author that article. So watch this space, because that will also be available open access. So I am going to finish. Final slide. Is it worth it? From a researcher perspective, yes, absolutely. I just think it offers powerful potential, and it moves away from this kind of top-down approach, and it speaks very much to young people's interests and concerns. More than that, it aligns very nicely with rights-based processes. So it's not about including young people because it's a nice thing to do. It's actually about seeing it from a rights-based perspective, that they have the right to be involved, they have the right to be heard. And it promotes this idea of learning with, and we have a huge amount to learn with young people beyond binary understandings of orientations, identities, and mental health. And that recognises youth social and cultural capital and youth expertise alongside complementary expertise like the researchers, the demographers, the policymakers, those kind of things. But it's about this kind of collaborative coming together. And those are just some publications there on the right-hand side from my PhD. But I'm now going to hand it over to the 3 young people, and I'm going to ask Erton, from your perspective, is PPI worth it?
Hi there, how's it going? I suppose I can start, or if Niamh or Jay are on the call. So PPI, from my perspective anyway, is most certainly worth it. I think particularly for seldom heard groups like LGBTI young people, it offers a way of, and this kind of is in a way similar to what Tony was saying, of contributing back in a way, in a really safe environment, and being able to feel like you're making a difference. You know, the basis of Nerly's PhD is rooted in government strategy. So, you know, being able to, knowing that what you're doing is going to feed back into hopefully change is really profound. And I think giving, again, seldom heard youth that opportunity is incredible. Having said that, I think PPI has to be done well. And I think Nerly certainly working with her, she embodies that working with young people is, I think, particularly difficult. You know, you've got varying schedules, especially 16 to 24. You've got very different stages of life where you're at secondary school, you're at leaving cert, you're starting college. Right now I just started a full-time career, you know, so you've got varying schedules, you know, at a fundamental level, and balancing those is incredibly difficult. And I think Nerly's done an incredible job at adapting to us, being very flexible, and that's a challenge. And I think often in academia and research, flexibility and agility and not having a plan is kind of it goes against the current or the paradigm, I suppose, of research. But being able to grapple with that uncertainty and giving a voice to, in our case, young LGBTI plus youth is great, and it's really great to be part of.
That's an amazing insight, and I wonder if Jason or Niamh would like to elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm Niamh, by the way. Like very much supporting what Erin is saying, and I think a very important thing when involving young people, specifically in PPI, or kind of really anyone from marginalised groups, is looking at, like, I think we throw around a lot with PPI the word empowerment and how we can empower the public or patients, but it's really important to look at how we're doing that. And, you know, for example, like working with Nerly, like we have got to come into a process that has been very adaptable, and we're working with someone who has the expertise in terms of policy and research and, you know, how to get work out there and get voices heard. And it allows us to just bring our expertise, which is our experience, to the table. And that is such an important part of empowering, you know, publics or patients alike. It's really important to look at what that empowerment process is, and to make sure that those buzzwords that we have in kind of these various settings are words that have more depth to them as well, I think. And that's something that like has been really standout for me anyway during the whole process anyway. I'm not sure if you want to add anything there, Jay.
Yeah, like one of the things that like both like Art and Scully kind of like touched on there in terms of like it's not just a matter of like asking people to participate, it's actually kind of the follow through on the other side of it. Like in my own kind of academic like work, I'm still a student in UCD, and like I wrote an assignment about the youth strategy, partially about my experience of being involved in that youth advisory panel. And part of what I was looking at was how much did the young person's contribution follow through to the end product. And there were times where I was writing and I was sitting there and I was saying, no, actually, there are moments where young people said stuff that didn't make it to the final version. And you know, I don't know why. There could well be an explanation, but it's an explanation the young people need. If we can't follow through on something that they want or something that they're raising, that needs to be shown and explained, that it doesn't end up being a situation where young people get really involved. Like these particularly vulnerable LGBTQ plus youth are getting involved and getting engaged, and then they feel at the end of the day that their work wasn't important or it wasn't meaningful or it didn't have an impact because they're saying, I raised this issue, this was really important to us, and it didn't follow through in the end. So I think that's a big piece. It's not just getting people involved, as great as that is, it's making sure the follow through is there to actually commit to what the young people or whoever it is you're asking to participate, to commit to what they're actually saying.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think what you're saying there, Jason, actually links in quite nicely with a point that James and Tony had made around kind of being clear at the outset of what can and can't be done. And as researchers, sometimes things cannot be done, but you would have a right to know about the decision process to that. And I don't know if James or Tony would like to come in, and Pádraig, if you're there as well, if you'd like to come in and kind of open up the discussion, and then we might pop to some of the questions that have come into the chat.
Well, from my perspective, having said that, I think it's getting the balance between, you know, what kind of can't be done based on, you know, maybe a protocol, but the reality is that often things actually kind of can be done. And maybe if I was looking back, I'd push the boundaries a bit further. Now knowing that you can push your supervisors or co-authors to change, or yourself to change things. So maybe not using that as an excuse, I suppose, would be my advice.
Yeah, definitely useful for any early PhDs.
Point there. I think it's a really valid point. But I suppose, yeah, like in the real world, you know, everyone's hands are tied to some extent. So
yeah.
We have been really guided by Laura Lundy's work, and her work is about participation and about the idea of creating space for voice and being very clear about who the audience is, and so that young people can influence decisions and decision making. And Laura Lundy says that influence is one of the least attended to aspects of involving young people and children around participation. And so she's written more specifically on that and spoken about the importance of dialogue and feedback. And I suppose for me, I think that's what we have emphasised in the book chapter. So we have talked a lot about some of the very positive things that came out of the policy and the strategy and those kind of things. And I will say to the young people, you changed the direction of the strategy. And they'll sometimes say to me, you know, well, I have to say to them, do you believe me? Because I think that it doesn't feel like that for them, because I think there was a missing feedback and dialogue sort of loop that was about fast feedback, full feedback, youth-friendly feedback or child-friendly feedback that was followed up, so that if things didn't happen, was there an explanation? And if not, was it going somewhere else, or what was happening with it? So for me, that's kind of like really informed how I've approached the PhD as well, and very much about kind of this idea of learning with the young people. Like they really are the future, without kind of going all Whitney on it, but yeah.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. And we have a few questions now, so we might have to pop to those. So we might go to Paula first and then go to the questions in the chat, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks. This is so interesting. I know very little about PPI, but I do know James and narrowly, and I'm heading into a job that's going to involve PPI, so I will be picking your brains a lot. I think Jason's question was really, really interesting, and I'm not sure if I've got the wrong end of the stick here, but I have done qualitative research, and you know, you do, like I was doing semi-structured interviews, you do great interviews with really interesting people, really interesting transcripts, and you have to leave most of it out because you simply don't have the space or the word count or whatever. I wonder, is that an aspect of it in this case? And the other kind of separate thing is, I've been involved in lots of, you know, government consultations or, you know, whatever consultations, particularly on environmental issues. And it's really, really frustrating to see, you know, almost like this tokenistic, we are consulting with the people. And you know well that if you say something that's not going to fit into where they want it to go, it's not going to go. So and I'm sure that's not the case in the work that we've discussed here, but it is a kind of it's something I have observed anyway. But I think Jason's observation or question is really interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that further, or it's definitely a hot topic within PPI. So I don't know that kind of actual. Yeah, Jason, if you want to.
Like it was certainly like from the experience of being like with that youth advisory panel with the youth strategy, and then writing about it and analyzing it after the fact. Like it was certainly kind of like you're saying about like the government consultation piece, where it's like, yes, they can't do everything. And I don't think that's necessarily something every young person who was involved would have understood. Now we're talking about young people who were as young as like 14, 15 years old, who may not have fully understood that because it wasn't necessarily something that was fully explained to them. But there was certainly issues that, let's say, would be more contentious that were raised by young people, issues that are like very prominent. And had at that point already gained quite a lot of kind of public exposure, that they were very pressing for the young people, but have been something that, you know, for all of the exposure they had already had prior to the strategy, had been not very much kind of paid attention to. I think that was part of it. It was part of like, this doesn't fit into, this isn't really what we wanted to hear, so we're gonna kind of park it a little bit and move on. And it wasn't like totally erased, it wasn't totally ignored, but it certainly wasn't as much of a follow through as I think we would aim for ideally when we're involving anybody, but especially like, you know, vulnerable people and young people in research like that.
I think that's a great point around researchers being open to getting recommendations and open to being told that maybe what they're doing isn't what the PPI panel would perceive as the most important, or wanted kind of to shift a direction. And as researchers, we have to reflect before we take on a PPI panel if we're, you know, we have to be open about the level of change that we are willing to enact within our research, and where are our hands tied and where can we actually make change. I suppose what we might do is move on to some of the questions in the chat, because I'm conscious that lots of people have lots of great questions. So one that's come in is around channels of communication between meetings. And I know Pádraig and I think James and Tony, you might have touched on this a little bit, but I might come to you, Pádraig, because I know you'd mentioned about collaborating between every 6 months there was meetings, but you kind of had communication between that. So is there anything you'd like to say on that?
Yeah. So like I said, we meet twice yearly, but it's regular collaboration throughout the year. That might be talks similar to this one. We provide PPI training and workshops in collaboration with our PPI contributors. So we work together on those. And like I said, when it comes to papers and publication, we always work together and collaborate on that. So it's more of as needs arise, and throughout the year, there's just constant communication, whether it might be related to a similar research group to our own that might be doing similar research, could be sent on and asked, you know, why is this work different from our own group? What are they doing differently, and why aren't we looking at XYZ? Why aren't certain variables in our project? And then, you know, it's really fantastic for the research team too, because that gives them a chance to actually say, look, oh, this is why, you know, we're going with this approach, and you know, they're actually being challenged upon multiple aspects of their research, which we found comes about after, like I said, relationship building earlier. Having time to work together, become comfortable with each other, means people are kind of more comfortable challenging each other and having these more honest and frank discussions. So while the early meetings were formal and, you know, biannual, as the relationship develops, it becomes more easier to have that informal lines of communication, and it kind of arises itself.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And Tony, I can see you nodding along. Have you any thoughts on that, or James? Or have you had experience?
Yeah. James, do you want to take that?
Sure, yeah. Well, one thing I found in terms of channels of communication that I really liked from Porix was the idea of having sessions where the PPI contributors kind of decided what they wanted to discuss and kind of presented to the group on it. I thought that was quite of an innovative use, because something I struggle with is was learning how to move up the kind of pyramid of engagement, and I liked that as an idea. Brilliant.
And I suppose on that then, this is a practical question that has come in around kind of resources to enhance PPI, and this might be to, is there anything that you would have found useful when you were planning your PPI, or when you were kind of looking at recruitment and so on? Nerily or Pádraig or James?
The first thing I would say is that for young people, email is not a very attractive form of a communication. So we have a WhatsApp group, and the WhatsApp group is much easier, and I can sort of tag people and I can follow up, and we have enough of a relationship now that if I don't hear from them, I know it's because they're busy rather than that they don't want to be involved. So it's really about me trying to find a way of approaching them and making it as possible as possible. So sometimes I'll get emails back and it'll be like, really sorry, I haven't replied. I don't know why exactly. And it'll be like a 4 o'clock in the morning response, because that's young people's lives. So it's a bit more about kind of that practicality. When we went online, I was quite concerned that we weren't going to have this sort of workshop style kind of thing. So we have used these sort of PowerPoint prompts or done other multimedia things. So listen to podcasts, read newspaper articles. We had a presentation with a demographer with a Q&A afterwards. And we did as much kind of like stuff as we could using Mentimeter and word clouds and those kind of things. We use polls for people to vote and that sort of stuff. We've recorded things if people aren't able to attend. And we now do a PowerPoint prompt when we're doing the recorded discussions. And I know there's a question in the chat about are the sessions recorded? And I suppose just to say really clearly, you can have a panel, a PPI panel that informs what you're doing and you don't record because you're not using it as data. But as soon as you intend to use any of this as data, you need to have ethical approval. And so we have ethical approval for all of that. And then what we have in place as well, because all these young people are identifiable, so all the quotes will be checked and they will make sure that that is what they want to say, and that will all be done collaboratively as well. So it's all takes a bit longer. So it all takes longer. That's really the bottom line. It takes longer, but is it worth it? Yes.
Brilliant. I think we might be tight on time, and I'm conscious there's such great discussions going on in the chat, so please do engage in those. But I think I'd love just to finish on maybe just a statement of maybe coming from the PPI contributors, if you're open to it, just kind of highlighting how you found PPI and whether there is anything, if you think of a PhD student that's starting, that you would want them to know as to what would make your experience with PPI good. So what advice would you give to an incoming first year PhD, maybe in one sentence, if that's possible? And Niamh, I might pick on you to come first, if that's okay.
I think what I would say to like first year PhD student coming in who's like using PPI, that don't be afraid to like ask for help and realize that they are the ones that's their lived experience. Don't be afraid to like tell them how you're feeling, or if you're worried about your PhD, or how you need them to be involved with you. And don't be afraid to adapt and like talk to your supervisors and stuff, because it's quite new, I suppose. And it's really important that we're like working from the ground up. So, you know, don't be afraid to speak your mind to your participants and stuff as well, I think.
Brilliant. So open communication and that honesty. So I don't know if Tony will come to you next, if you've a one-liner piece of advice.
Sure. Well, how did I find the PPI experience? Really enjoyable. As I said earlier, for me, it was an opportunity to give something back, which I was more than happy to do. And it, you know, it's been a lovely experience. It really has, you know, meeting really nice people and just working in a very pleasant environment. So yeah, it's been a very positive experience all around.
Okay, so the importance there of relationships. So maybe for PhDs to make sure that you commit that time to getting that nice kind of warm relationship and that rapport building with your panel. And then Ayrton, we might come to you for a final comment on a piece of advice, if you have any.
Yeah, I think just to echo Niamh in particular, like lean on the PPI panel or the group. More than likely they have elected to be part of it, to be part of the panel out of intrinsic motivation. So they're incredibly motivated and they have a desire to contribute and to help in any way they can. And I suppose to help that, just really empathize with the situation. I suppose coming PhD students are in a particular situation and context in a university, and that's often very different to where the public and patients are at. So yeah, lean on the panel, but also be open-minded and really empathize with the individuals that are part of it. That's kind of what I would say.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that links in nicely kind of around the point even that James made around language and making sure that you know the population that you're working with. So we have gone over time because I could sit here talking about this for a very, very long time. So sorry for keeping you over time, but it was a brilliant discussion. And like I said, there's lots of comments in the chat. So if you want to engage in that after we close this session, please do, because there's some great conversations going on. And again, a huge thank you to all of the speakers. It was absolutely amazing. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. So just to note, we're going into a 30-minute break now, and we'll be meeting back at 12:15 for our final 2 sessions in the main room. So if you'd like to leave this running in the background while you go and have your sandwich, or you can log out and join the Zoom link again at 12:15, whatever works best for you all. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ayrton. Thanks, Niamh.